Welcome to a new course on C++, and I'm redoing this video, so it's going to look way different than the rest. I might redo some of these if I'm not happy with them, but I felt like the compiler one was way too long, so here you go. I'm going to give you a quick rundown. You just want to be able to get your program compiling. That's the main thing for this tutorial. There's a lot of options for compilers, and basically what a compiler is something that reads the code that you write and turns it into an actual program that you can run. And it can also turn it into a library or something for other programs to run, but that's a little more complicated. Just think of it as something that interprets the code you write and turns it into a program you can run. Now, one of the simplest ways to do this on Windows is to download Visual Studio Community Edition 2019. It's a free program. It's kind of large, but you can get a C++ workflow with it. And when you open it up, you'll get this, and you can just do something like create a new project. And then you can do whatever you want here, but let's do empty project to make it really simple. And this location, I'm not happy with them. Let's put in repos, and it doesn't matter what the name is in my case, so I'm just going to hit project 1. And what this does is it sets you up with the Visual Studio compiler. So somewhere in here we can look at it and it'll tell us, but it's basically using the Microsoft Visual Studio compiler. So we can always look up more about that. Let's do a new window and let's just look up compilers for C++. Close enough. So you'll see a whole bunch of them. There's the GNU one, that's like the standard Linux one. One of the things to know about these is some companies will make their own versions of compilers just for their specific use, and they won't release them to the public. There's MainGW, which is like a cross-platform compiler that works on Windows and stuff, and Linux and Mac. And there's also Clang, which is another one that's cross-platform. We'll see in a bunch. Not all of these are actually what I'm looking for. I'm not seeing the MSVC one listed here. Also, I spelled compiler wrong, so there's the Visual Studio one. So a lot of integration or development environments, which are IDEs, integrated development environment, like Visual Studio, will just come with one. And up here you can choose how you want it to build. You want it to build and debug or release. Now real quick about debug and release. Debug builds with some symbols to help you walk through your code and maybe find little peculiar errors that are hard to discover. And x64 or 86, 32-bit is 86, 64 is 64-bit. Generally, you just want to do 64 these days because why not? But like Visual Studio gives you all your project files over here, and you can click this little Show All Files button to get an actual structure, and there we go. So when I hit Run, it's going to compile all the code that I've written. But there is none. I've written no code, so it's confused. And generally what you want to do is you want to make a main. So I'm going to do it with the Visual Studio one, and I'm going to switch over and do it a different way just to show you there's multiple options. But for your sake, you just need to get any of them working. If you're using Mac, you can look at Xcode, or you can do it in the command line. I'll show you how to do it in the command line here as well. That will work with Linux and Apple. But first, let's for example show you how you do it in an IDE. Now your IDE will vary a little bit, but it's basically the same. Basically you want to add a source file, a .cpp.c++ file, and call it main.cpp. And in here there's a standard bit of code that every program needs, and it's the entry point. It's when you compile it and set it up to run, it's where everything starts, and that is always a function called int main. And I'll explain this real quick. Int is what it returns. It returns an integer. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Main is the name of the function. It's just what it looks for. It has to be named that. You can optionally put in a few things here like int arg c and char star arg v with some brackets. It will also find this version of the function, and you don't really need to worry about these a whole lot right now, but they are basically variables that you can pass into the function when you start running it. argc is a count of how many variables you passed in. There's always at least one, and it's the name of your software. So by default it does pass in, it'll be project 1 in this case. So there'll be at least one argument, and it's going to be the name project 1. And argv This is an array. I'll talk more about those later, but it's just all the different arguments. If you don't pass in anything, it's just going to be only one of them, and it's just going to be, it's basically a row of characters. Think of it like text. The standard cout hello world is what you usually see, and if you've seen any tutorial before, that's probably what they've done. And then you have to return some sort of integer because it's expecting one for this return type. And we could also say something like, and I'll explain all these in a second, you are running argv 0. Arrays start at 0. We'll put a new line here, a new line character. So I'll walk through all this code just to make sure you at least understand the hello world. So I've explained most of this top part, but in these little brackets here, start and end the function. They're called a scope. Standard is a namespace, which I'll talk more about later as well, but basically it's where something is found in code somewhere else, or that's how you can think of it at least. And basically what it does is it helps you not overlap, because if you have something else that happens to be named cout, it can be in a different namespace and it won't have trouble. So don't worry about that too much. But as you can see, this is complaining, it's got underlined, and that's the static analysis from Visual Studio. So Visual Studio is saying, hey, I don't recognize this. It's kind of helping us code. That's the really nice thing about IDEs, is they'll sort of help you walk through and underline obvious errors. So you can actually right click on this in Visual Studio and do quick actions and refactoring, and it'll tell you what you need to do. You need to include IOStream, which is a header file. It is a standard header file that allows you to use cout. It also allows you to use cin, which we'll talk about more later. But for right now, let's just do cout. So it's console out, the other cin is console in. So we're basically saying spit out to the console, and then you're going to have these two alligator brackets. And then the text you want surrounded by quotations, and this /n is a new line. So it's going to spit out hello world and then a new line to the console here. Correct it a little bit, and then it's going to do it again. So this just operates in order from top to bottom. Next it's going to do another cout and say you are running semicolon, and then we can continue it. You either end the line with one of these, or you continue it by after your first quote putting these alligator brackets again and something else. You can put variables in here like this character array. We could also put in here like argc, and it'll spit out whatever this integer number happens to be. In our case, it should be 1, and then we can follow it up, and just be careful about your spacing. So it'd be like, it should say 1 dot and then you are running, and then whatever the name of what we're running. This should basically evaluate to project 1. And then after all that, a new line character. If it's just a single character, you can put it in single quotes, but if it is multiple characters, you have to put it in double quotes. And so let's go ahead and run this now by hitting our local Windows debugger. And there we go, we got some output. So it's hello world, 1 dot you are running, and this is actually the full path, but at the end you'll see project1.exe, but it gives us our full path to where it built our binary or executable. So there you go. That's how you do it with an IDE in general, and as you add stuff and add new things, you'll go further. We'll talk about more of that later, is to get it compiling. So we're going to exit here, and I'll do it a different way that's more specific to command line. So I'm actually going to open a program called Cygwin. You can go install this. If you go look for it, you'll find a website for it and a setup, and you just run the setup. And this is basically a Linux-like command line for Windows. It allows us to use the GCC compiler that we were looking at a moment ago. So we can kind of get a Linux sample here, but as you can see, we only got a command line. We don't have an IDE in this case, so we have to make our own setup. We do have to type in things ourselves. We have to manually configure things. Some people like this better. If you're following a Linux tutorial, this is where it's going to start you. You could do most Linux type tutorials on Windows with Cygwin. There is also, I'll mention, WSL. So Windows has recently started integrating Linux into Windows with this Windows subsystem for Linux. It is going to be very similar to what you're seeing on Cygwin, but it basically gives you like Ubuntu Linux shell or command line. So you can optionally use this for all your compiling needs. As you see, it gives you some instructions. There's walkthroughs on that if you want to get it going. Cygwin's a little faster and easier to get going, so that's why I've done that. And I've just installed it in my root. So now I can use Linux stuff like ls to list my files. And I could basically use other Linux commands. So I'm going to do a couple real quick to give you an example of setting up a new project. So we're going to do a make directory command. And let me just zoom this in a little bit. And I'm going to just call this project 1 as well. So we're going to make a directory called project 1. Now we hit ls and we'll see we're in project 1, and we can change directory into project 1. Now this tutorial is not really about these Linux commands, so I'm going to breeze over that. But some of these basic ones you'll need to know if you're doing command line stuff. And in general, if you're coding, you'll get used to them. So now that we're in our project, it will do another ls to see any files, and there's no files. So we want to make some files. The one we know we need for sure is a main for C++. So we're going to type a command called touch in the main.cpp. And what this does is if the file doesn't exist, it creates it. But generally, you want to use the GCC compiler. So you want to make sure you have that, or in my case, I think it's called G++. You can do -- version. So if you type in this command, it'll tell you whether you have it or not. And you can see I've got 10.2 here. So if you don't have it, you'll need to install it. If you're on Linux, it's just like a sudo apt-get install G++, which won't work here in Cygwin. In Cygwin, you have to run the setup again and go through and pick all the C++ stuff. So hopefully you've done that or can figure that out. But basically, I just want to show you how to do this in command line. So we made our file. Let's now edit our file. If you have Visual Studio Code installed, Cygwin will detect it, and you can just type code, and then either your folder, which is this folder, which is just a dot, or your file, and you can open the file with Visual Studio Code. And here we get the thing. There's another way to do it, like you can do it with Vim by typing in my.cpp, and this gets you the standard Vim editor, in which you can also do Vim stuff. I don't want to talk too much about Vim because it's complicated. I did a tutorial on Vim if you want to check that out. But basically, you just go into insert mode, and then you start typing it in. Oh, we got to wait. So there we go. So that's essentially the same as opening it in Visual Studio Code or any editor and operating it there. But starting out, I would recommend not using Vim right away, or maybe you're hardcore and you want to, that's fine too. But I guess the point is we can do all the same stuff as we could do on Visual Studio, however we're using a different compiler. Okay, so looks good. I'll close out of that. And now to compile this and turn it into a program, like if you're using an IDE, you usually just hit the play button or the build button, and it essentially runs the command in the background. On command line, you'll need to do something like this. You invoke your program, and then you feed it whatever it needs. There's a lot of different options. We're just going to leave it all default and just compile this one thing. And now if we look at our stuff, we see we have an a.executable. We can give it a different name with a -o command, and we'll name it maybe main, and then we're going to feed it the main.cpp. And that way we can get one called main.exe. So either of those will run the same right now, they're built the same. And you run it with this // and then the name of it, command line. And there we go, we got our stuff. The world you are running, it tells us what we're running. So hope you're able to get your compiler running and move on to the next tutorial. Thanks for watching. Peace out.